Hi, I'm Tom Zimmerman from the EMDR podcast. Thanks for joining. This episode is from the road, so I apologize if the lighting and sound may be a little bit off. I'm traveling to do a training and kind of sitting in the car thinking, and what keeps coming up is a almost offhand comment that I made in my last podcast, in which I was exploring many really effective, really highly powerful psychotherapies that do produce astonishing healing in a very short amount of times. And I was making the case that these approaches to therapy seem bizarre, but they only seem bizarre if you compare them to what we're used to doing. And I want to talk a little bit about what we're used to doing, in part because I'm hoping that if we can kind of really highlight what our best intuitions are in trying to figure out how to resolve trauma, we can see the lunacy in it. And we can find that these approaches to therapy that we do really are sensible, and they really are, in some ways, they're not only the antidote for trauma, but they may also be an antidote to a whole lot of our maladaptive coping. Because one of the things we know is that when trauma happens, we either make sense of it, our nervous system is able to make sense of it, or we carry it, right? Two main scenarios. I suppose we could partially make sense of it, but the most common scenarios is we either digest it or not. And when we carry trauma, one of the things we know about carrying trauma is that necessitates survival strategies. That necessitates coping strategies. It is, as a friend of mine said once, it is, trauma is the tax we pay to exist. And a lot of that tax to exist is the tax in maintaining these coping strategies that allow us to, in many cases, literally survive the ongoing need to survive what we're carrying. So one of the most common strategies that we will use to try to make any kind of workable sense of trauma is we will think about it, right? We will think about it. We will ruminate on it. We will try to put those Jenga pieces in an order that makes sense. And everything we know about trauma really does make clear how silly that attempt is, right? Because trauma is stored in the limbic brain, highways of connection between the limbic brain and the brain stem. It's very, very easy to cause a catastrophe in the body with even the tiniest bit of activation. And we know, the way memory is stored in implicit information inside those implicit packages, their negative beliefs or schemas or, shortcuts to survival. And many of those may be very hot, may be very dramatic, may be negative, may be binary, may be not nuance compatible. And a whole lot of what is true is found in the middle, and in schemas, that in these kind of beliefs about ourselves, trauma encoded beliefs about ourselves. There's not much of a middle. It's not much of a middle at all. So it is very difficult to make any kind of workable sense of trauma. And one of the reasons, and I know if you're a therapist, you've seen this over and over and over. What is it that we're trying to make sense of? A lot of times what we're trying to make sense of are existential questions, right? Why did this happen to me? Which if we personified a blade of grass, a blade of grass might ask the golf ball, why did you land on me? And that, and from the blade of grass perspective, that's a really, really existential question. So why was I born to these people? Why did my mom not know how to love right? These are questions we are never, ever going to have a suitable answer for. And if we were to sit the people down, if we had the power to sit the people down who most hurt us and made them somehow through magic, tell the truth, they probably wouldn't know, right? They probably wouldn't have a sensible explanation. And if they don't have a sensible explanation, how in the world can we possibly intuit that? So we may try to make sense of trauma. And one thing you might think of is, what have you ever made sense of? So when healing comes, very, very rarely does it come in Eureka ways. Sometimes Eureka ways can help us contain our trauma much more deeply, much more concretely. It may almost kind of help us in some ways entomb trauma, or attempt to entomb trauma, which may be helpful, but again, it has cost. So from a container metaphor, one of the things we know about trauma is that if it's containered, it has a lid that never quite seals. So that lid always seeps at least a little bit, and sometimes that lid blows right off, and we have a catastrophe. Other ways that you'll hear clients try to make sense of trauma is with the idea that if they can just make it real enough, and part of what making it real enough means, you'll hear this in client talk when they say, if I can just show my mom, if I can just figure out how to show my mom how bad she hurt me, then I can heal, right? And that's often difficult conversations that trauma therapists have to have with clients, in which we have to let clients know that that forgiveness, when it comes to forgiveness or apology when it comes to trauma, rarely works. And very often, the people who hurt us, the very things that allowed them to hurt us, are some of the many and various defenses that they have against you ever really being hurt. And besides, people are who they are, right? Your mom is your mom. She is not going to change short of a neurological event. Right. So the good news is that we don't need anything new from abusers for us to heal. And that is something that's important to tell clients. But clients will spend their lives, good chunks of their lives, if I could just figure out how to show them. Or somehow to get back at them, the other thing is that some coping strategies, in fact, many coping strategies, are in some ways understood, or at least they function as a proxy for processing, right? So that may not make sense. So part of what I mean by that is, one of the most sensible strategies people may come up with in managing and dealing with trauma is to stay ahead of it, right? Staying ahead of it. I mean, lots and lots of people do it. It makes sense up until the point that it doesn't. I think many CEOs of major corporations, this is probably one of their survival strategies. They stay ahead of it. I think a lot of the World War II and a lot of the Vietnam era veterans stayed ahead of it. And it is a sensible strategy, and it does get incorporated into identity in this ways. See, look what I've done. Look what I have done. that is evidence. So staying ahead of it is evidence that I'm not affected by it, right? Look at me and the amazing things I do in this world, as evidence that that stuff has not hurt me. I'm beyond it. It's in my past. And again, that works all the way up until it doesn't. So how many clients have we had where they've been staying ahead of it, and then something comes and trips them? And then whatever it is that trips them isn't the presenting issue when we see them in therapy. The presenting issue is everything they've ever pushed aside. So we will often see clients several weeks, several months after something tripped them that slowed them down. And now everything that they've ever been through, ever pushed aside, catches up and piles on top all at once. But for a while, staying ahead of it can feel like victory. Staying ahead of it can feel like reprocessing. It can feel like I'm mostly free of the difficult stuff that I've been through. Other survival strategies that we use that often will serve as a proxy for reprocessing, or there'll be something that at least feels like a workable strategy to process or manage trauma, is that we will dissociate from it. We will, trauma causes many things, many parts of the self to become, dissociated and estranged, often from each other. So one of the things that we do is we will attempt to simply vanish the wound, right? And you kind of know what happens when we will push things away, when we do not let ourselves know what we know, is that does create a pretty significant whiplash effect when we're confronted with the reality of what has actually happened to us. So, and that one of the costs of dissociating trauma is that when it shows up, we often don't have words for it. It can create a little bit of an identity crisis. And that whiplash, the reality of it, whiplashing into the body, can cause an enormous amount of distress. One of the ways that we do dissociate or attempt to vanish it is when we do comparison, right? So many people, so many of us never really get around to dealing with it because it's not really that bad. It's not nearly as bad as Helen had. It's not nearly as bad as my neighbor had. Or even we'll compare, right? We'll compare to, other family members who had it so much worse. Or so in a lot of ways, there are a whole lot of strategies to try to disconnect, to try to dissociate, to try to vanish the wound. Because one of the most, in a lot of ways, sensible strategies for dealing with any problem is to make it not a problem, or an attempt to make it not a problem. So this is something that we have to deal with quite a bit, and it does not work. But we will spend a good chunk of our lives letting that be a pretty compelling strategy to square ourselves, or to make some kind of workable sense of some of the things we've been through. And related to that, while it's not a processing strategy, it is a survival strategy that really does serve as a proxy for dealing with stuff, is distracting ourselves from it. And the more I think about it, it seems safer and safer to make the case that there are really no limits to what we won't do in Western cultures to distract ourselves. I mean, we can think of Western culture as having the primary task. We think of pursuit of happiness as our goal. Really, it is. It seems to me that one of the most compelling missions of Western societies is to comprehensively distract ourselves from ourselves, and we're doing a really, really good job at that. But when it comes to trauma, nothing buried is ever lost. So again, this is that tin can we kick down. We can kick down a very, very long West Texas road. So we try. Also, one of our most common, I would probably even say, next to kind of thinking about it, one of the most common ways of dealing with, directly or semi-directly dealing with our trauma is medicating it, right? Medicating it. And we can talk a lot about that. Medication does have its role in dealing with symptoms, but there is no mainstream, maybe experimental ways, but there are no medications that will move a memory from one part of the brain to the other. And if we can agree that the goal of healing, regardless of the approach that you use, is to move a memory, is to make a hot memory a normal memory, is to make a traumatic memory more of a normal memory, there's no medication that can do that. The medications only deal with symptoms. They only deal with the surface part of a wound. They do not deal with the infection at the center of the wound. So there are many, many other ways, I think almost subconsciously, that we do try to make sense of what we've been through. How many people with pretty extensive trauma that or how many of your clients consume it, really do consume trauma? How many people do you know consume pretty endlessly the 1 hour Law and Orders, the 1 hour 1 hour true life murders? So there's a lot there. There's a whole lot there that is kind of both interesting and bizarre culturally, how we ourselves are traumatized, and in attempts at mastery, we experiment. We experiment by making entertainment out of the suffering of others. It's an interesting dynamic. It does provide some proxies of closure, right? Most of these things provide at least a symbolic ending, or if it's a true life murder, it at least provides some answers most of the time, and it's entertainment that provides some form of closure, and there's remarkably little of that. So we can go on and on and on in describing, addictions as dissociation. We can go on and on and on in describing, effects of personality in the way we internalize stuff in our personalities, and how those may be attempts at making sense. But they all share something incredibly, incredibly common, which is that from the top to bottom, from the most common to the least common ways that we have to try to deal with, to try to process, to try to make sense of what we've been through, whether it's trying to get our attachment needs met through closeness of others, right? Trying to repair attachment wounds by having lots and lots of unstable relationships. Every attempt, every strategy that our best intuitions lead us to do not do what we hope that they're going to do. And again, like I mentioned in that prior podcast, what these things often do is they end up resulting in more entrenched wounding. Our survival strategies often cause an enormous amount of subsequent wounding, which we see, right? We as trauma therapists who resolve and deal with these wounding experiences that people have, often we have to deal with the long aftermath of what we can see now as maladaptive coping. So I'm running out of patience when I hear that trauma therapies that are highly effective are bizarre, right? We don't have time for that. We don't have time for that. If our best cultural intuitions are these things, we need something other than that. We need something that is non-intuitive, right? We need something that actually works. So let's look at, are these attempts successful? Do they move a memory from one part of the brain to the other? Or are they a way to simply kick a can down an astronomically long road? So let's develop some non-intuitive approaches to healing. And what we have to do is these have to be things in order to heal ourselves. These have to be things that people can do on their own. They're going to have to be eventually. They're going to have to be things that people can do on their own, because the impulse to process trauma on our own is way too deep. So one of the most important things we can contribute to this world are strategies of self-healing that work. Strategies of self-healing that can move a memory from one part of the brain into normal memory. So let's figure that out.